Dikaios Sakellariou. Am I pronouncing that correctly? I am a certain. He is one of the editors of the Occupational Therapy Without Borders series, and has also written some other really influential books about the politics and the political practice of occupational therapy. And we are so lucky to have him. Thank you for coming.
Well, thanks very much. Thank you. God, it feels very bizarre to hear my voice from the speakers now. So thanks very much for inviting me here, Pam, and thanks very much everybody for coming here today. Pam just told me that most of you are final year in the MSc in Occupational Therapy program, and I think that's a very good timing to have this lecture. Then, because I'm going to be talking about critical occupational therapy, and I want to unpack a bit that notion about power and how we use it in occupational therapy, and also occupation. What is occupation, and is it something that I do as a person individually, or is it something that happens between people? And if so, if it is something that happens between or among people, then how do we start exploring that and looking at, the complexity, if you want, of what's going on around there? So, I think, okay. No, how do I, okay, I'll find it. Yes, I got it. So I'll begin by explaining what is critical occupational therapy and what I mean by that. I'll go on to talk about the individualization of occupation. So basically how occupation has come to be seen as something that belongs to the individual sphere rather than to the communal or the social, if you want. And then I'll be giving two examples. The introduction is going to be very short. Then I'll be giving two examples. One of them is about my most recent research with people living with ALS, amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, or Lou Gehrig's. So what happens when some people need home modifications, when some people cannot access their home environment and something needs to change within that? Who decides what is necessary is what I'll be talking about. And the second one, which in a way follows on from the first, because as we'll see, the first one is kind of related to sexuality too, but the second one is more specifically about sexuality and disability, which can be a bit of a contentious issue because of all the ideas, if you want, and the cultural innuendos and the value, sexuality, moral wrongs and moral rights, and disability as well. And then I'll wrap it up talking about the intersubjective nature of occupation. What does that look like? So when we're talking about occupation happening between people, what is that about? And occupational justice, then I'll bring it all back full circle to the notion that what we do as occupational therapists focuses on promoting an occupational justice, promoting access to participation, promoting access to daily life, or in other words, promoting access to occupation for everybody. And the summary. So critical occupational therapy. So I don't know how many of you are familiar with this table, but this is the table from the World Health Organization. And then it has been adapted by Charles Christiansen and Elizabeth Townsend, two occupational therapists. And it has been adapted specifically, really, to show the influences of different factors on occupation. So you see on the very left side, you have what is called underlying occupational determinants. So the type of economy that we live in, regional, national, international policies, legislation, rules and regulations, values, and more specifically, values underlying policy, and cultural values. What we think, so if we're talking like sexuality, what do we see as acceptable practice? What do we see as non-acceptable practice? What is a bit of a gray area? What is in between? And then you have occupational instruments or programs. So, all these different, if you want, infrastructure that help us carry out occupation or influences the way we carry out occupation, like housing and education, employment, transportation, recreational facilities, universal design, accessibility, the surroundings, if you want, part of the structure, in between the structural and the contextual factors. And then you have factors, if you want, contextual factors that work on a personal level more than anything else, or influence at the personal level, like age and gender and sexual preference and ability and disability. But these, although they are personal, my gender is my gender and my sexual preferences are my sexual preferences, but we go back to structural factors. So cultural values influence. So if I identify as gay or straight, that has different innuendos and different associations in different societies. So although that is my choice, if you want, the cultural values attached to it will influence my participation in different ways, whether it feels safe to go out and take a walk, for example, where it does not. And then we go down to what all that leads into, which is occupational outcomes. So do people have participation? Can people participate? Do people find meaning in that participation? Can they choose what to do? Do they have balance in their occupations? So I think this will provide a bit of a framework, I think, and we're going to be revisiting this when I'm going through the examples. So in critical occupational therapy, what we're interested in is the power differentials. So how, if you want, we all have power in different ways. Having access to education is power. Access to a profession is power. Access to language can be power. So how differential? So when some people have some power and when some others do not, or assume they do not, what happens there? And then often in health and social care, there is that construction that, there is a service user or a service recipient or a client or whatever the current term of, term is, and then a professional. And this is often considered or constructed as a relationship of power imbalance, basically. Somebody is there, and as health professionals, we're trained and we're licensed and we get paid to provide services. But also the problem becomes when we think that we're entitled to make decisions for other people and to know that we know that what is best and what is not best for people and of the way how to lead their life. And that can lead to compromised participation to the daily life for some people. But also that happens, obviously, not only in that very narrow example of the health interaction that I just mentioned, that happens all over, in daily life. So something to consider about when we're going through the example later on, and I think it will become a bit more concrete and more real as I'm talking through the examples later, is, who has power and what is it and who doesn't and what does that look like and why and what's going on there. And I think I'll be reminding you of this throughout the examples. But for now, I think it is enough to remember that power is dynamic, as French philosopher Michel Foucault said, is dynamic, it's interactive, it is a process, and it is diffused in society. So it's not a matter of I have power, you don't, or you do, I don't. No, it's a matter of, okay, how do we negotiate these balances here? What happens? So if I have something that you consider to be, for example, if I cannot communicate very well, can I use that to my advantage? Or can it not? Is it going to exclude me? Or is it not going to exclude me? I had an MSc student of mine. She did her master in public health a couple of years ago, and she was based in Vancouver, Canada. So she did this study with women who had just arrived from sub-Saharan Africa as refugees in the greater Vancouver area. And these were women who were not, who were of limited literacy. They couldn't write in English and they couldn't write in their own native language. So that was part of it that excluded them, and there were power differential because the whole, if you want, society is structured for people who can read. And, if we're talking about, any American society or Canadian society is structured for people who can read, and more specifically who can read English. So when you do not belong to that group of people, then what happens? And so, yes, there was a power imbalance. They had limited power. On the other hand, that enabled them to belong to other groups of people, to other belongings of people who had similar experiences, and be enabled to participate through that. So I guess it's the social groupings that people create. So when I feel I'm being excluded, when I feel I'm being marginalized, who can I ally with, in a way? So, and we're going to return. So power is dynamic, basically. I think what I wanted to. So occupation. If we visit occupation for a minute, So it has been defined as the things people do, very simply by Claire Hawking, a professor from New Zealand. Everything that we do in our daily life, me here, standing up and talking to you, and you being here and listening to a lecture, or, going to work, or taking a shower, or going out to the movies, everything that we do in our daily life. And I think the interesting thing about this definition is that there is no, how shall I put it, no judgment or no value attached. So it doesn't say it's the things people do that make you feel well. It's not the things people do that are good for you. It's not the things people do that occupy your time. No, because this is all different for everybody. And what are the things that make you feel good? And why things that don't make you feel good, are they not occupation? So it's everything that we do in our daily life, basically occupation. Obviously, as occupational therapists, we're only interested in part of this whole spectrum. But occupation is everything we do. And then Kilhofner also had added, not to that definition, obviously, but the way he defined occupation, that it's everything we do, but usually at an individual level, or not necessarily at an individual, but at an individualistic level, it is being processed individually, occupation, within a society and within a communal context that was being taken into account, obviously, in his theory. But it was something happening in society as an individual, though, you're doing. So I just want to, just very briefly, to go through that occupations like houseworks, doing the ironing. And these are all sources from the UK, where I'm based. So, you see ads from, this one is from the 50s, I think, and we're going on to the 90s. And then we're going to Great Expectations. So, exploring the promise of gender equality in the UK. So let's see what's been happening across the years. If we're talking about, who does the laundry and ironing by relationship makeup across the years. And here you have, over there, women born at 58 and women born at 70. And you see by, gender breakdown. And it hasn't really changed that much. It hasn't changed that dramatically, if you look at it. So yes, it is something people do individually. You do ironing by yourself, really. You don't do it with somebody else. But the reasons why you do it, and the reasons what does that mean, it's not individual. I can't imagine many people getting that much satisfaction out of ironing, saying, "Oh, I'll do it. No, let me." In my experience, it doesn't happen. So why? What are the values attached to it? What are the systems, if you want, that entice people or that force people to do it, that work in subtle ways? That is that, yes, ironing is an individual occupation. It does happen individually. And if somebody, comes to the occupational therapy clinic and they cannot iron and you need to work with them on that, it's going to be an individual, obviously, therapy session. But the reasons why people do it are not individual. So that's one that I wanted to point out here. And another example that you can find lots and lots of references and statistics for is care, is the construction of care. And that is probably closer to home and as occupational therapists, and something that I'd imagine you probably have already encountered in your clinical placement, or I'd imagine, I'm pretty certain you will be encountering in your clinical practice. Care. Who cares for people? And about the physical care, the emotional care, who cares for for when things go wrong? Who can stay back at home and look after, a relative, a spouse, a child? And then the interesting thing is how care has been constructed as a private matter and what people do, which obviously means that some people are undervalued in society, people who offer care, undervalued and underpaid through that. But that is a gendered role as well. Statistics show, at least statistics from the United Kingdom and many other countries in Europe, that it is usually a role assumed by women rather than men. And the final example is, that is from, if I can, yes, I can get the video. So that is a very brief clip from, I think it's an American, some kind of news program at the time of the Olympics that happened in London. So if I can
There'll be no Olympic gold for a group of British men who want their sport in the Games. They're competitive, synchronized swimmers. But because they are men, they are banned from Olympic competition. They've written a letter to the Olympic Committee and want the rules changed in time for the Games in Rio in 2016. No response, though, so far. I think if women are doing it, men should do it as well.
So, yeah, another example. So basically all these examples, small examples really to show you that, yes, we carry out occupation individually. Yes, we relate to people on an individual level. But whether it is that what we're allowed to do, like, men wanting to do synchronized swimming in the Olympics, sometimes things are allowed, some things are not allowed. And, for ironing, care. And there is no reason why things should be like that. There is no reason why it should be women doing their ironing. There is no reason why men shouldn't, do synchronized swimming if that's what they want to do. So occupation happens at an individual level. That is correct. And at the social, collective, interactionist level. So what we do, if you want, is conditioned by the context where we live. Is conditioned by what the context where we live allows us to do. And, you see, I've added all the references at the end, so you can look up, if you're interested, to see how people have built on those arguments. For example, Frank and Cantardis and Molyneux. So the first example I'll be going through, just to go into a bit more depth in those issues, I call it constructed needs. So it's from my research with people with ALS, and I'll be talking about that a bit later on. So what we already know is that there are diverse rationalities, and that is a term I believe was used by Cheryl Mattingly from University of Southern California a few years ago. And what that term means is that, on a very simple level, is that different people have different perspectives. We all come from different, we have different life histories, different worldviews. We want different things, we see different things, we need different things. So these are that is a diverse rationality. And if we extrapolate or concentrate, if you want, more on the health provider and service user or client interaction, then, it only stands to reason that a health professional, a health provider, and a client, a service user, it is quite likely they'll be coming from different ways. They will be seeing things different ways. They will be wanting different things. They will enact, if you want, those different rationalities. Or in other ways, they will think that there are different ways to reach a successful outcome. Because in occupational therapy, in any rehabilitation really, we're interested in getting an outcome, right? A successful outcome, a good outcome, something that will make people good and happy, and something that will be recognized as, and reimburse then a successful treatment. And this all sounds very good and very well, but things are not always that straightforward. So when we're talking about a successful outcome or a good outcome, what does that look like? What is that? And what happens if my good outcome is not yours? What happens then when there is is there a trouble? What's going on? So I want to show, I'm going to discuss about what happens when, I'm going to focus on one couple living with motor neuron disease, which is ALS or Lou Gehrig's, in Wales. So what happened with that one specific couple when they interacted with the health professionals, trying to create a way of living, trying to be able to stay in their home, and how these different rationales or perspectives were enacted. And I'm going to be doing that talking about home modifications. So what home modifications, and I'm not quite sure what the term for home modifications is in the US. Is it home modifications as well? Or adaptations? When the home environment basically needs to be adapted to accommodate for the impact of an impairment. And these modifications do provide an arena where we can actually see those diverse rationalities. Because it's my home, I know what I want done in my home. And then you have a health provider or a social care provider coming in to tell you what you need to change in your home and what you can get money for or what you can get reimbursed for. And then, people tell you, okay, this is good, but this is not good. But this is somebody's property and somebody's house, but somebody's home as well, where people, raise their families, where people are with their spouse or partner or children or, extended family. So I'm going to focus on that one couple's experiences, really, trying to do that. Just very briefly, I believe most of you will know what ALS is, but, it's incurable, neurodegenerative, unknown etiology. And the life expectancy is usually short, between 3 and 5 years, but there are 4 different subtypes. But in the most common subtype, it is for 3 to 5 years. And it can lead to complete paralysis of all voluntary muscles, which means that people, will need maybe a wheelchair, maybe they will need a stair lift to go on the second floor of their house if there is one, and functions such as walking, eating, talking, breathing are often affected. And so often people with MND or ALS often have to modify their home environment to be able to move around and keep on using it. So what is the purpose of home modifications? And I should say here in the United Kingdom, home modifications are usually assessed and recommended for by occupational therapists. I'm not quite sure if that is the same. What is the legal framework in the US? But in the UK, it is an occupational therapist who's actually the one, if you want, who is the gatekeeper to home modifications very often. So the purpose is to reduce physical barriers from the home environment, to make it safer. It's one key word, and to make it more accessible is the other key word. And they recognize statutory rights in the United Kingdom, which means that people have a legal right to having home modifications if they're deemed to have a need for those. So obviously there is a disclaimer, not everybody can have a home modification, but there needs to be assessed to be of that quality, or if you want, or of that degree that warrant a home modification. And then if that is the case, they get what they call a DFG, a Disabled Facilities Grant, from a local government, and to carry out the modifications. But they're not allowed to carry them out individually as persons. They have to go through, if you want, the health and social care system. So yes, they don't have to pay out of pocket. Yes, they get the grant, but they have to follow, if you want, a process to do that. So the initial impetus, or part of the initial impetus in the United Kingdom, why home modifications became a right, was the disability rights movement from the 70s and independent living system, independent living movement, because that meant really, if, for example, you have accessibility issues, in your house, and then you get a grant, it means you can stay in your house, yeah. So it promoted independent living for many people. But also, another cause why it was introduced and why it became a right was the cost effectiveness. Yes.
How long does it take for this in England for them to get this grant?
Okay, that is a very good question. Statistics in Wales, where I'm based, show that in 2012, I think it was, I can't remember the exact number of days, but I think, if I remember right, 352. So that is a long time. That is a very long time. That is not the time that it takes to get the grant. That is the time from initial application to getting the work done.
Okay.
But
completed or just started?
Done, completed, and but 352 days, we're talking about a whole calendar year. Yeah. That's very long. And if you live with a condition like motor neuron disease, it's 3 to 5 years life expectancy post-diagnosis, and you're not going to have access to that right away after your diagnosis. It's going to be months after. It can be, and in any way, you don't want to be, if you have the right to it, you don't want to be waiting around for 2 years before you can get the work done.
Can I ask you one more question at
Sure.
this point in time?
Sure.
And do they just do one modification, or are they looking into the future to see the furthest, most help you would need?
They do, yeah. So what it is, so in this case, for example, if if somebody has a progressive disease, but they can still access the second floor of the house, where usually in the United Kingdom is usually where the bathroom or the main bathroom of the house and the toilet will be. Even if you still can access that, they will decide to move it downstairs or to move your bedroom downstairs from an early stage. So they're going to be doing 2 or 3 works at the same time, within budget though. And there is a very specific budget, it's not unlimited. And I can't remember, is it 30,000? Is it 30,000 British sterling pounds, I think? I'm not quite sure of the exact, I think it's around 25 to 30,000. Which might sound like a lot of money, but it's really not. So for most people, what they can get for that money is a modified bathroom and maybe a stair lift, and that's about it. So it isn't. Also, although yes, technically they have to get or they can get more than one modifications, practically it doesn't happen, and people, if they need to, they will have to pay out of pocket to do that. And part of that, the timing will definitely come in again later here, but it's a very important, thanks for raising that, that's a very important issue, timing, especially for people living with motor neuron disease, but for most people, really. And cost effectiveness is the other thing that to keep in mind here, because it wasn't only an impetus to get them going, really, to set them as a right, but cost effectiveness actually guides how they're being performed and how they're being delivered, if you want, as a policy. So if I give you some context as well, so we're talking about, this is related to the notion of a service user as a consumer, what has been called as a patient consumer by Mould, who is a historian at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, and she talks about what happens in the post-war, if you want, historically in the post-war period in the United Kingdom until to the years of the Thatcher administration, Margaret Thatcher in the 80s. What was the transformation of the national health system, which is a public health system in the United Kingdom? So what she examined lots of literature and lots of regulations and lots of, if you want, legal papers, recommendations from the government and from the health system for over those decades. And what she could see was the change in emphasis in the health and social care from a patronizing, or what was seen as a patronizing or paternalistic system, to the rights of individuals within marketized services. So this notion of a patient consumer, this patient consumer is expected to make those choices that are right for them, those choices that are going to make them achieve the life they want to achieve. But they're also expected to assume responsibility when things do not go right. So if home modifications do not go right, whose problem is it? Who's going to pay? Who's going to live with the consequences? And then if we go down to the guidance from the Department of Communities and Local Government, which is the part of the ministry, if you want, or the department of the British government responsible for home modifications, they very explicitly state that home modifications are individualized solutions to the problems of people experiencing disabled environments. So they're seen as something, individualized, which is good. I mean, it sounds, good really at face value. We all want an individualized solution to what we're going through. However, if we look at the good, what is the good? So if I spoke before, I talked before about the good that we're all expected to achieve through a health or social care interaction, or in an occupational therapy clinic, or in any interaction really we can have. So we want to achieve something that is good. So in the case of home modifications, that good is an environment, a home environment, with reduced physical barriers. That is in the UK that enables accessibility, and then enables people to stay on in their own home. So, most actors involved in home modifications, which involves the healthcare provider, the social services people, the service user, recognize that as a good. But there are different ways that this good is understood, or if you want, realized or enacted. So one way is you can see, a home with reduced physical barriers enables what philosopher Jackson from Harvard University called a home in the world. So it's, if you want, our own personal space. It's where we can truly be ourselves, where we can relax, and where we can be with our family, where we can be vulnerable and not be afraid of being vulnerable, because there is nobody there to watch, and if there is, they're part of our own little world. So it's our home in the world. It's where we can experience that intersubjective life, that life between people, and where we feel recognized. Okay, people know who I am here, and people are not going to judge me. People are not going to make value statements about who I am and what I look like and what, where I come from. That is where I belong. So that is a home in the world. And, home modifications can enable that because, they enable you to, be in your home. They enable you to cook a meal. They enable you to sleep together with your own partner because, you might need a modified bed, for example, or they might need to change your bedroom from upstairs to downstairs. So they enable all these activities. And also, a home with a limited, what also they do, home modifications, is that they contribute to the retention of the locus of care. So care, if you see that as a process, can happen in many places. And with reduced physical barriers, that locus of care, that the place where care happens, can be moved home. So for people living with ALS, for example, oftentimes they need to be using equipment like non-invasive breathing equipment or gastrostomy. And years before, that would only happen in a hospital or a nursing home, or it wasn't always possible, really, to have this, to carry out these processes and still keep on living home. But now, with home modifications and with the increased funding for home modifications and increased emphasis, people can stay at home. So that is what an average home would look like in Wales from the outside. Houses are pretty small. So they're usually divided into 2 floors. You have the ground floor or the first floor, and then so in the UK it would be the ground floor and the first floor, I suppose the first and the second floor. And you would have the down floor, the ground floor would be where it's the more public space. So you would have your front room, your living room, where one would entertain or would see friends, and the kitchen would be downstairs as well. And upstairs you would have the bathroom and the bedrooms, one or more. So really, they're not very accessible spaces physically. They're not. And you can see it here. I would only say, this is real-life dimensions. It almost is. They often can be quite small, quite narrow. So the couple that I'm going to be concentrating here, I call them, it's a pseudonym, obviously. I call them Dave and Marion. And they were people in their late 60s, and they'd been married for 40 years. And Dave was diagnosed with ALS only, I think, a few months before he participated in the study. And the study was about experiences of people living with ALS in Wales. So I wanted to see what happens in their daily life. So he had already been diagnosed, he had already been accessing some services, and he knew he had a fast-moving variant of the disease. So although it was only a few months after diagnosis, he was already experiencing many physical symptoms. Like he had to use a wheelchair. He would access a wheelchair pretty early on in the process of, pretty soon after being diagnosed. He He couldn't speak very clearly. He was getting tired because his breathing muscles were getting very weakened. So they got referred for an assessment to get home modifications. But what happened is that they found they had to negotiate different priorities, and what was good for them wasn't necessarily what was recognized as good for the professionals. So one of the main recommendations was to have a through-floor lift for them. Or no, it wasn't before, so that was a second recommendation. But initially, so the healthcare professional, the occupational therapist went there, and then they suggested that, okay, we have to move you downstairs. We're going to turn the sitting room, the living room into a bedroom and a toilet. So, that will be a home environment for you. And, that sounds right because that's cost effective, and, there doesn't have to be any knocking down of walls, and, there's going to be just a toilet down there where, part of the living room, and the rest is going to be a bedroom, which sounds good. Only, it wouldn't allow for a double bed. So that means that Marion, the wife, would have to sleep in a different room. And that was not acceptable to them because, they lived together for 40 years. And Dave had a terminal disease for all practical purposes because it was moving so quickly. And they were afraid, okay, we only have, a year, 2, 3 years, tops, together. And they tell us we have to sleep separately in different rooms. That's not happening. But then, people were seeing that as the most cost-effective way, though, because, it was about keeping him safe and keeping him at home. But anyway, later on they decided to have a through-floor lift, which is an elevator, basically, that could go from the ground floor, from the first level to the second level. So he could still access the second level. So the idea of having the bedroom downstairs was abandoned, and then they decided to have that lift, to go upstairs. But even that really wasn't that straightforward. And you see here, that's a quotation from then, and Marion is saying, and they say, well, Dave can sleep there because he would probably need a special bed quite soon, and so I would need a bed then. She tells them, and they tell her, oh no, you will have to sleep somewhere else, and she says, oh, that's not possible because, and he comes in, we want to stay together. And then he contributes and says, yes, we do want to stay together. But it's not only that. He actually does need me in the night. It's not only that. Apart from that, he does sometimes need me in the night. And it's this sort of adaptability I can understand. And it's that thing, and they say somebody else is making decisions. They tell them how to live their life, if you want, within that context. And then she moves on, Marion, Dave's wife. And then the occupational therapist wanted upstairs to knock a hole between the middle bedroom and the front bedroom, because they had 2 bedrooms upstairs where we would sleep. And I said, why would you do that? And because they were already widening the doorway, there was no reason why they would need, to knock down on the wall as well. I said, there is more room for you. But that wasn't really the case, because that would cut down, it was still a living environment. It wasn't a hospital. It was their home. Apart from being, yes, their needs were developing, their needs were changing, but that was a home for them. They didn't want that to resemble, if you want, an aseptic hospital environment. What was the point? And so for the perspective of the occupational therapist, you need a clutter-free environment, a clean environment, wide spaces. But for them, they saw it in a different way. Where would they keep the mementos of their lifetime? Where would they keep pictures of their 3 children? What would remind them of the life they've lived together for 40 years? And how would they, adapt, if you want, to the change in nature of the relationship? What is happening? So for the occupational therapist, it was about, functionality and cost effectiveness and, doing things, if you want, in a way that would accommodate ALS. For Dave and Marion, it was not so much about accommodating, yes, it was about accommodating ALS as well, but it was about enabling them to still be who they had been for so many years with the addition of a terminal incurable illness. But it was the focus on them was on how they felt, how they wanted to live within that context. So what eventuated is they felt they constantly had to defend their wishes against those of the professionals with whom they had to, invariably work. So for them, the house was a place to foster relationships. They wanted to sleep together. It was as simple as that, really. They wanted to be able to still share a bed. They didn't, and at least a room, if nothing else. They didn't want to either, Marion having to sleep upstairs and Dave downstairs, or in the same floor but in different bedrooms because they would knock a wall in between. They just very simply wanted, either a big double bed, so a room big enough to accommodate that big double bed, or two single beds. But again, that room would have to be pretty wide because, two single beds, needing access all around the bed as well, would require space. But that's what they wanted. A place where they could be a couple still. However, that was recognized as a desire. So they wanted to be a couple. They didn't need to be a couple. They didn't need to sleep together. They didn't need to enact that, if you want. So from the very strict guidelines, if you want, of legislation, home modifications legislation, they need to provide the most reasonable adaptation to enable somebody to remain safely in their home environment. There is nothing there about sleeping with your partner. There is nothing there about, sharing a bed. Nothing about being a couple. Yes, it's that we all recognize that as common sense, of course that would be a need. But it's not technically. You can still live. It's not unsafe. So that is the focus there. In the end, they did get... am I stopping here? Yeah, although in the end, after lots of negotiation, they were able to do it. It still took lots of negotiation because it was seen as a desire, not a true need, and needs trump desire quite often. So I think the divergence between what is a need and what is a desire, and who decides that, points to these different worldviews where, sometimes where we come, or providers come from, and service users. So for Jackson, again, these different worldviews, so what we view, what we want, what we engage with in the world, is not abstract, it's not a theory, it's not, it's not abstract, it's something very concrete. It's about how you achieve a viable way of living, how you create a way of living in the world. So is your way of living, does it involve a double bed or does it not? And can you or can you not have it? It's something very concrete. And I think as occupational therapists, often the dilemmas we are faced with are also very concrete because it is about daily life, it is about occupation, it is about what people do. Excuse me. So their experiences tell a larger story really about how they experience the construction of some expectations as needs and others as desires. Subjugates people to policies and legislation, and that's what I mean by technologies. I mean those policies and those legislations. An infrastructure, if you want. It is an infrastructure that forces you to act in different ways. And if we're talking if cost effectiveness is the main parameter that we use to value or to judge, to evaluate participation in occupation, which is the case with home modifications often in the United Kingdom, then a desire can be a liability. Now, a desire means more money, extra funds. Where are they going to come from? Who's going to pay for those? And who's going to wait for those to be carried out? But then what does that say about people who have those desires? How are they constructed? Are they constructed as the bad patient or the bad consumer or the bad service user who is abusing the system? And we're talking about a publicly funded system as well. So all these notions about, fairness and equity and, people only taking their share and not taking more than they're entitled to. So what does that mean for people and how does that make them feel? Coming back to the question about timing, in the case of Dave and Marion, they were able to get the modifications done but only a fortnight before he died. So they got the room ready, and then he got admitted to the emergency room and passed away very shortly after because of breathing difficulties. And I was with them. They participated in the study throughout that year, or in their case, I think it was a bit over a year. It was a year and 2 or 3 months. Was it 14, 15 months that it took from initial assessment to actually have it done? And they participated in the study throughout that period. So I would see them every 2 or 3 months. And every time they would communicate that frustration and, okay, we're being chased by time now here. We really are running out of time, and I can see myself slipping away, was what Dave used to say. And Marion was getting very anxious about all this. And they had to chase people up about, okay, come on, hurry up. But then, obviously, because the system, the way the system operates, that couldn't happen. Different cases, individual cases cannot be prioritized. They had to wait, and waiting they did. But it meant that those modifications were not of much use to them in the end, although the good did happen in the end, because the process was so insensitive to the particular circumstances. It wasn't of much good after all. So what I wanted to show through that example really is what happens when you have different perspectives, what that good operate and come in contact with each other. What does that look like? And if we go back to that table from them, Christensen and Townsend's book, we can see, yes, people wanted to sleep together, and there was a disease involved as well, and there was participation and all that. But really, what carried everything, or what influenced everything, or most of the stuff, was the cultural values to begin with. Okay, now you're a couple in your mid-60s, maybe early 70s. Do you need to sleep together? Do you want to? So part of it was sexuality. Was, okay, you're living with a disease. That is not a priority. That was the health provider's notion. But also it is the type of economy, if we look at it in a broader way, it needs to be cost effective, basically. It needs to be what you do. It needs to bring in more money or to save more money than the money you're going to spend on it in the long run. And that is the stark reality of home modifications.
In the end, it wasn't cost effective at all, was it? It was a complete waste.
No, in the end it was not. But it has to be cost effective on paper at the beginning. That's what it is. But you're right.
It looks like Lorraine had to leave, but she studies these same issues in the U.S., and this process is similar. It takes so long to get the technologies that often they arrive too late. Yeah, same here.
Yeah, and I know it is not really it's not cost effective at all. But it needs to be presented in a cost effective way. And to do that, it needs to be a need. And I remember when I worked in community care, we could, and I was working in adaptations, and I was doing home modifications as well. And I remember that it was all about explaining and justifying what you wanted to do, and explaining if it was cost effective or not. So it didn't matter. I mean, it could be really ridiculously expensive, but if you kind of present in a way that, okay, that's going to save us money, you could have it. If you couldn't, and it could be something minor then, if you couldn't justify why somebody needs, I don't know, a pillow, a special pillow for $50, you couldn't get it. But you could get something for $5,000 if you could justify. So it was that thing about, you need to present in the language that people who can make decisions understand. And that leads on this example. So in this example, I talked about the different perspectives and different, if you want, interpretations of the good. And one of the issues there, partly, was how people want to enact sexuality. And by sexuality, I mean, the different ideas and values we have about our own self and our own body, and who am I as a man and who am I as a woman, and, how do people interact with each other and how they express emotions and feelings. So I'm not talking about sexuality in terms of sex, but sexuality is a broader concept, and I'm going to come back to that. So for Dave and Marion, it was also about, sharing a bed. That was part of who they were and part of, who they wanted to be. So if we're looking at sexuality and disability in a broader way now, and before I go on, are there any questions from the first example? Yes?
What type of healthcare
healthcare system does Wales operate under?
Right, so it is the whole of so Wales is part of the United Kingdom, and the whole of the United Kingdom, they have what they call the National Health System, which is a publicly funded health system. But home modifications the money for home modifications come from a different pot of money. They come from the regional government. So each area or city or consistency in the UK would have what they call the council, the city council, and they would have a budget, and they're required to give money for those home modifications through what they call a system called the social services. So it's not strictly, there are occupational therapists working there, but it's not within the national health system. It's a separate entity to the health system.
So far, what I appreciate is that Dave and Marion were able to articulate their needs.
Mm-hmm.
In the case where persons may feel disempowered and therefore are unable to demand what they need within the system that exists within Wales, is there any opportunity for an advocate within the system to strike a balance, between the different powers, so that they could effectively receive the care that they desire?
I'll answer briefly your question, then I'll give you an example as well. The short answer is no. Okay. In a case like this, when we're talking about there are no capacity issues and no decision-making issues, there is no possibility central. I mean, yes, people can access organizations and patient support groups, and they can get advocates through those, but there is no possibility for an advocate through or within the system. And for people to access an advocate through an agency or an NGO or a patient support group, they need to be advocate. They need to be confident enough and know the system enough to access that. So I remember when I was working in community care in London, in South London, some 10 years ago, I remember seeing that couple, the same age, more or less, around in their 60s. And the lady had a CVA, a stroke, but she had the stroke many years before I saw her. So she'd been to emergency room when she had a stroke, some 10 years before I saw her, and then they saw her, and then they discharged her, and then somehow she fell through the cracks. They were immigrants into in London. They were not newly arrived, so they knew the language and they knew the system a bit, but not enough to know what they can demand and what is the right and what is not the right. So they thought that was normal practice, and nobody was there to follow up. So when somebody did pick it up eventually, and that was, I think, around 10 years later, and then she got referred to the community team that I belonged in, and then I went. And it did take me quite some time to understand what was I couldn't get my head around that actually that was a person that had just disappeared from the system, was in need of services, and money was not an issue because it is a publicly funded system. So, that wasn't a factor at all playing into this, having or not having access. It was just somebody who, because they didn't know what they were entitled to, and they couldn't, advocate for themselves the way Dave and Marion did, then they didn't get anything in the end. Or they didn't get anything until 10 years later, which was, we're talking about a stroke, so 10 years later was pretty late. And it meant that they spent 10 years that, they went through some problems that they shouldn't have had to go through. Yes?
Other than this system in place, are there any nonprofit organizations that I guess people could go through to maybe speed up? Maybe you won't get the same amount of funds, but maybe smaller, less complex conditions.
There are. For motor neuron disease, for example, there is the which is ALS. There is the ALS Association in the UK, and they can fund some stuff. So they can fund smaller, or they can lend out equipment like powered wheelchairs, or they can lend out equipment such as breathing devices, but they cannot offer as much money to modify the home environment. But yeah, there are, and many people, although it is the right to have that through the national health system, many people don't, because it takes such a long time. So they prefer to go through support groups to get some of their needs covered. But it is okay for people who live usually in an urban area, in a city, but people who live further out usually don't have as much access or as easy access to those services. Yes?
Doesn't it come down to a question of what is medically necessary versus what is personally necessary? And therefore, the person who's providing that money is going to be focused on what's medically necessary. So how do we take into account what is personally necessary and then get that funded? And to me, it's a very difficult thing to say. And they're funding more in England than they are here. When we start to go outside of the realm of medically necessary, does that then tear up the whole system?
Yeah, I know, and I think that's why the system, or that's why the regulations are interpreted so strictly, because the regulations talk about needs and make people safe at home and cost effective, and some keywords there. And I think you're right. It is very difficult if we're going through person-centered care all the way, if you want. Okay, what are the limits there? Because obviously a system cannot fund for everything. It's not reasonable for it to fund for everything. And I mean, the only thing I can say, and the only thing I say to my students back in Wales, is that it's a matter of clinical reasoning. You have to make those judgments, really. That judgment, okay, what do you think is actually needed here for people to have a good life, and what is not? But I don't know how this could be regulated for. Yes, I see. Yeah, you're the gentleman.
Knowing that the equipment takes so long for the patient to obtain, what does the OT do to maximize the level of functioning at that point? And how is it safe for them to be in an environment that doesn't suit their needs as of that moment?
Improvisations. So what happened in this case with Dave and Marion? So while they're waiting for the equipment and the home modifications to arrive, she had to sleep in a sofa, in a settee, in one room, and he had to sleep in a single bed, and he couldn't go upstairs to shower, so he had to, get a sponge bath in the sink in the kitchen, and that went on, for a long time. And for different people it's different, but it's improvisation. Unless, it's improvisations for people who cannot afford to access private modifications, because if you can access it privately, if you have the financial resources, but also the know-how, because not only having the money, is also knowing how am I going to spend that money, where am I going to go to get that thing done. So if you have those, if you have the literacy, the money, and the know-how, you can get it quickly. Yes.
Are they looking at ways to speed up the process so that people can utilize, the lifts and stuff like that, since it does take so long? Are they looking at ways to kind of speed up the process so the funds can be used?
Yes, but the ways they're looking to speed up the system, the process, the way, as far as I'm aware, is to make sure that it's only people who need them will get them. But to do that, it means that, then we go back to the other. It's a very strict interpretation of what is a need and what is not a need. So it can go either way then, because then if you exclude all these other, a bit more personalized needs, desires, then yes, it could be a bit quicker, maybe not. Sorry, you had a question before?
Well, it goes back to what...
Your hand, let me give you this.
So if I had to use a mic, it's only fair that you use one as well.
She's a low speaker.
Hi. So I think I wanted to go back to what Professor Getty said about this idea of medical necessity versus personal necessity. And one of the issues that I have with all of this is we are trying to educate our students about what client-centeredness actually is. And I'm assuming you're doing this in the United Kingdom. And it troubles me greatly that in your presentation, the occupational therapist who did the home modification evaluation completely negated the desires of that couple, irregardless of the fact that there is a strict interpretation of need versus desire. And I would hope that we are training and educating our students to recognize that that is not a dichotomy, that there's really an interrelatedness between needs and desire, and we have to address that. And it, I don't know what school of thought that was from, or why it wasn't addressed in any way, shape, or form in the evaluation. Because why call something client-centered, or call the fact that a goal should be client-driven? That the values, needs, and desires and wants of the client have to be taken into consideration to make it a true goal. But that really isn't what's happening in this case.
No, it wasn't. And I think what is important to keep in mind as well is that that was not what was happening in this case at all. But also it is important to keep in mind that occupational therapists, yes, we need and we are trained to provide client-centered care. We hope we do. But then there are all these limitations coming into play that we'd never anticipated. The limitations from practice and limitations from setting and time and resources. And sometimes people can get overwhelmed. So I'm not quite sure in this case, because I didn't really engage with the occupational therapists that much. So I would hesitate to, have a critique towards her. Although, at face value, that doesn't seem right. But I think what I would put at the level of the institutional policies there more than so that they really didn't enable that sort of practice. They really did not enable that sort of client-centeredness and person-centered practice. Because you're right, there shouldn't be a dichotomy as such. It was a dichotomy here. In this case, it was very much a dichotomy, but I don't think there is an either-or. That's why, we train, that's why we have our clinical reasoning, is to try to merge those different, what is needed for somebody medically and what is needed socially, emotionally, in these more intangible aspects of, because it's like, living with illness is just living, like any other notion of living, with the added complexity sometimes of physical, whatever people might want or need. So you're right, it shouldn't be a dichotomy there. It should be more of an intertwining of the two and a balance. Yes?
Wait. I don't want to
So who sits on the DFG board? Is there an OT that's part of the grant board that's out there, since the OTs are doing the assessment, that can kind of work together to say that, it's not as simple needs and wants? Do you know who is actually on this board that?
Yeah, there is usually social workers, occupational therapists. Sometimes there is a nurse or a medical doctor, but usually not. And then bureaucrats as well. And I think, there is an occupational therapist, a social worker, and administration. Oh, sorry. Oh, yeah, I'd forgotten about that. Yeah, I'm being recorded.
We're learning as we go.
There is, but the bureaucrats are far more than administration personnel. The bureaucrats are outnumbered the other specialties. Yes.
I have a follow-up question.
Oh, is it? I have a follow-up.
To my previous question about the type of medical system.
Yes.
I don't think it's working.
I can hear you though, it's fine.
Okay. So you mentioned in an earlier slide the marketized services.
Uh-huh.
And so I was wondering, what does that word mean in terms of a public system? Is a marketized service only for those who can afford? There are those things.
Uh-huh. Not only that, I think that was it was introduced in the 80s with the reconstruction of the NHS and later on, but what it means in this context, it works as a mini market, but not really. So people get the money. A mini version, let's call it a mini version rather. So people get the money, yes, they get the DFG, and they're told, okay, you can decide now, you can do whatever you want, but you can't, because then you have to go back into the system and be reassessed, and people telling you what to do. So it gives you the idea, the impression that, okay, I'm a consumer here, and I get that money, I get that check, and I can buy, right? I can go out and buy a bathroom. I'll buy myself a staircase. I'll buy myself, whatever I need, and an adapted kitchen. But you can't. First, because that money is not enough to, for you to buy everything you want. And secondly, because for health and safety regulations, because it is a publicly funded service, whatever you decide to do will have to be also recognized because it's a good use of money. It has to be recognized as good use of money by, the agency that gave you the money. So they give you the fallacy that it is a market, and in a way it is, but maybe not for you. It is for the system. So you can't actually buy what you want to buy, but you set off thinking that you might be able to. Is that clearer? So do you guys want a break now? I don't know how you're used to, because I go on to the second example? Or yeah, so we'll have a, I don't know what it is, 10-minute break? Okay, I think we need to make a start, because I ended up having more slides than I thought I would. Yeah, that's life. So the second example is about, more specifically about sexuality and disability. So what I mean by sexuality here and what I'm going to be talking about is sexuality is a part of human experience, interrelated part of human experiences, and integral part of human experience, and really connected, interrelated with many function areas of the individual, closely connected with the cultural context. So, function areas, we're talking about, cognitive function and physical function and social functions, and, people enact and embody those in different ways. And then you get a cultural context. What is good, what is bad again, and what is right, what is acceptable, what is not, and all that. So it's a broad concept, and it includes gender identities and role, who is a man, who is a woman, or other ways that people identify. What are the roles associated with genders? Eroticism, how people feel sexual. What is that about? Is it body and, again, interconnection between people? Sexual orientation, intimacy, how people relate, how people can get intimate with each other. Sex, so that is the physical act, if you want, and things around the physical act of sex. And what do we mean by sex? What does that act involve? Are we talking about penetration, or is it, an act involving use, in a heteronormative way, a penis and a vagina, and there is penetration, and then we're done, and then that's sex? Or is it something more nuanced for, different people embody that in different ways? And reproduction can be a part of sexuality for many people. And, this is the definition of the parameters from the World Health Organization from 2006. What am I doing? Yes. So sexuality has been talked about as a way of being in the world, and by being in the world, who am I now? How do I carry my body and my weight, and how do I relate to people, and how do I understand the world around me? And so if we go back about sexuality encompassing this idea of who am I as a man and what the roles entailed, involved. So, that is my way of being in the world, and everybody's individual way of being, if you want. There has been lots of research that show a strong link with overall health and well-being of sexuality. And sexuality is defined in many different ways in this research, so, we cannot really do much systematic, if you want, so much review, or I cannot give you any statistics. For the most part, they talk about sexuality in terms of sex and intimacy, but, and they show a strong link with overall health and well-being. And again, there is equally lots of research from different disciplines, from anthropology, from occupational therapy, from sociology. So in this, sexuality is an important dimension in what people consider to be a good life, and to construct a good life, and to be part of that good life. And again, I'm talking about sexuality in that broad way of, embodying who you are and your identity, the gender identity as well. And again, there's been quite some research in occupational therapy about sexuality, and sexuality having an innate occupational dimension. So if we're thinking about the things that we do and how we embody, how we enact gender identity, it is through occupations, different things we do and how we engage, and how we engage sexuality and intimacy. We're talking about physical acts and preparation, and dating is part of this, and getting ready to go out, to go on a date, and getting together with somebody, sitting down for food, everything that, so for example, a date might involve, this is a deeply occupational choice, or going out shopping, for one's partner. And there was an article in Aged years ago, I think written by either Jenny Jackson or Florence Clark from the University of Southern California, and was about going out to shop for one's partner, and the occupational dimensions involved in that, and how is that a meaningful activity. People. Oh, it was by Jackson 95. There it is. So, oh God, that is 20 years ago. It's not 10 years ago. It's a long time. So, so individuals can express sexuality through different and many occupations. However, although we do know that, we have the research, we have the writings, and experientially, we know that, sexuality is an important part of many people's experience in life. Whatever, whether they live or they don't live with an impairment or illness. However, occupational therapists express, and there is lots of research again that I'm going to show you in a minute, express many anxieties, many dilemmas regarding sex and sexuality, and there is research from many parts of the world, so it's not only concentrated, it's only because it's that country or this country or that cultural context. No, it's across many different cultural contexts that people experience and express, those anxieties and dilemmas. So it's a bit like that, really. Yeah, one is thinking about positions, the other about escape moves. But why? Why is it often ignored in occupational therapy? So we see, okay, my IT skills are not great, so these were supposed to be in different parts of the map. They're not, but you can still read them. Is there a pointer? Oh yes, there is a pointer. So you can see there is lots of research across the world from, starting, I think the first one was in 79 from the States, and the 80, 85 in Australia, and 83 in Canada, the US again in 88, and the UK, lots of Australia, France and Denmark, Ireland, Brazil, Sweden, Australia, the most recent one is from 2014 from Ireland, the oldest from 79 from the States. So this is all research about whether occupational therapists feel comfortable addressing sexuality, whether occupational therapists feel comfortable addressing sexuality, and whether they do it or not. So all of this research showed that A, occupational therapists feel that yes, sexuality can be an important part of practice. B, they do not address it. C, they do not feel comfortable addressing it. People start from the premise or the assumption or the conviction, if you want, that it is occupational in nature, it is part of life. Yeah, we can see that it could be very important for many people, but no, we don't feel comfortable, no, we don't do it. So why? And different research has offered different explanations for that lack of understanding and lack of engagement. First and foremost, most important, is the lack of knowledge. So people report that, okay, yes, we'd like to, and we don't really have any hang-ups around it, but we don't know what to do or how to engage in that. We don't have the knowledge, is basically what people express. Which in a way is understandable, partly, and not partly again. Because as occupational therapists, I guess, we come in contact with many different occupations that our clients want to perform or that they do perform, and we don't really know all of them. We don't really know particularly what's involved, but we're quite skilled in doing occupational analysis. we're quite skilled in dividing an occupation in its constituent parts and saying, okay, what does it take, what does it involve, and take it from there. Now, with sexuality and sex in particular as an activity, therapists report that they're not comfortable in doing that. So there might be a lack of knowledge involved, yes, when dealing with broader issues of sexuality, but when we're talking about a very well-defined, if you want, occupation, a physical activity, it can be broken down in its constituent parts, like any other activity, really, physical activity, and then modify that, whether that is, I don't know, modify its positioning for people with rheumatoid arthritis, for example, or whatever it takes. So there is the lack of knowledge, though, to keep in mind. A second factor, a second parameter is client factors: age, marital status, and gender. So are you only allowed to have sex up to a certain age, and before over that, okay, you shouldn't really. And I'm going to be here to judge you and to say, okay, you're a 30-year-old man. Okay, I'm going to talk to you about sexuality. You're a 70-year-old woman. I'm not. And who makes that judgment and why? And so there is gender involved. There is marital status, and people in Highland and McGrath, 2013, the study from 2013 that was carried out in Ireland, said yes, it would be appropriate if people are married. If they're not, we're not. So, there is all this client factor. Sexual orientation can be a factor, and there is research. Ginny Jackson, again, who used to be in USC, Southern California, but she's now in Cork, Ireland. She's written about heteronormativity in occupational therapy and in occupational therapy clinics, but there are other authors who've written a lot about heteronormativity in healthcare. So, would this only be addressed from a heterosexual point of view? Would you include diverse opinions and diverse perspectives on sexuality? And how? So that's a second factor. A third factor that has been raised is concerns regarding safety, and particular therapist personal safety, especially in settings where boundaries can be in community-based settings, where people think that, okay, if I open up and I start talking about sexuality, that might put you in a vulnerable position, and open up, and they're afraid of boundaries, so personal safety, but more in the sense of boundaries and what's going to happen there, if I expose too much of myself, or if they literally, if people, I guess, if the boundaries blur, what's going to happen there? Or whether people are going to cause offense or anger if they raise it. So there are occupational therapists, again, in research from Conine, Coldrick in the UK, and Highland in Ireland, talking about, okay, yeah, I think it's appropriate, and yes, I would be prepared to talk about it, but I'm afraid I might cause offense, or I might anger some people, or that it's not going to be relevant for some people. And how do I don't want really to unsettle or to upset people. Which links on to the next cause about the lack of relevance, the perceived lack of relevance of sexuality, the perceived lack of importance of sexuality for people with disabilities. And we're going to see later where that comes from, that notion of asexuality or asexuality. Somebody, it's as if one entity is being foregrounded, then a disability, an impairment, a disease is foregrounded, and everything else subsides or recedes. And, okay, no, sexuality cannot be relevant, cannot be there. A bit like what I mentioned in the previous example, people wanted to share a bed. But why did they want to share a bed? And there was that value judgment or inability perhaps to understand from the perspective of the health providers that, okay, that it was a way for people to live and to express who they are, and part of it was their sexuality. Another factor that is given, again, through all of this research, for why people do not engage with sexuality in clinical practice is practices and policies at the institutional level that do not prioritize sexuality. So, and again, this is from the UK, Ireland. I'm not quite sure where Conine, but that's quite old now anyway. So quite often policies, at least in this context, in Ireland and the UK, do not prioritize sexuality because, you have to be in and out of the hospital. It's not, again, going back to cost effectiveness, it is not cost effective for you to stay in longer. And, a therapy will be provided, a service will be provided, and then you will be discharged. And sexuality sometimes doesn't get addressed within that. All that is what people report. That all comes from relevant studies about clinicians' practices. Another cause, very important, is personal beliefs and attitudes. And we go back a bit to the lack of relevance, to the perceived lack of relevance and importance of sexuality, and to the client factors that I mentioned before, age, marital status, and gender. So it is the personal beliefs and attitudes of therapists, and that has come up in lots of research. Again, okay, do I make a judgment of who should and who shouldn't be sexual? Do I make a judgment of who should and who shouldn't have access, to sexual rehabilitation, for example, or to sexuality-focused services? Or will I only talk about sex with, a certain kind of a client, but not with other kinds of clients? And I'm talking here again about, age and marital status and sexual orientation and gender and all that. How do I open up? How do I address that? Do I address it in an open way? Do I hide it? Do I expect the service user to bring it up? So it's all these personal beliefs and attitudes that people report, and that make it hard for the issue to be introduced sometimes. And finally, it's a lack of clarity regarding professional roles and practices. And was it last week or a couple of weeks ago, I was given a lecture on sexuality and disability in a different university in the United Kingdom, and it was a class of people who were already qualified healthcare providers of different specialties. There were medical doctors and nurses and occupational therapists and physiotherapists, and they were doing some continuing professional education. And they said, okay, yes, yeah, we're interested in that, but what happens in our team is that, we pass it on to the other person. And so, a nurse would pass it on to the social worker on to the doctor on to the OT, and go on and so on, because professional roles are a bit blurred there. Okay, who does what? So who's irresponsible? Whose job is it? And it's quite interesting because, it is part of our framework of practice framework, right? And the new edition that was out in 2014 in the American Journal very specifically mentioned sexuality as a function area and something that is part of our area of concern of occupational therapy. And yet people, and that was the previous version as well, not only the latest one, but the previous from whenever the previous was out. But people still report a lack of clarity regarding roles. So we can also see that some of these, some of the factors that people mention, and all these factors, they're not unique to occupational therapies, they're not unique to healthcare, they're not unique to that particular site, but they come from different social discourses of sexual acceptability. And again, it's what I said, okay, whom do we approve or accept or acknowledge as sexual, and whom do we do not? And it's lots of research, again, from many different disciplines shows that, okay, there is a privilege of monogamous heterosexual relationship between young, able-bodied adults. And perhaps in the media, in discourses, in the social, if you want, understanding, there is a preference in depictions of sexuality using such an idealized version. And obviously this is problematic for disabled people, for everybody, really, because this is an idealized version in a way that not many people would fit within that. So where does that leave everybody else? Where does that leave other people who do not want to, who cannot fit into that normative ideal? So that normative sexuality fails to account for diversity and excludes people. Basically. And it acts in different ways. So there are many different many different processes that act, and socially, they present sexuality as something yeah, not quite for you. Infantilization is one, and I'm going to be talking about them. Okay, will I? Let me see what I have in the next slide. Yeah, no, I won't. So I'll talk about them here. So infantilization is one of them. You know, this, again, notion that, okay, so the result, you know, you're accessing services, or, you know, you have an impairment. Okay, so you're not quite like me. Are you childlike, or are you not? Are you still an adult? Do you have capacity? And capacity can be a very contentious issue for many different ways. Dependency, and how does that feel, and how do people perceive dependency, and what people perceive dependency to be. Existential anxiety, which is a very interesting one. You know, people being afraid, and people being afraid that, okay, you know, there is somebody different from me, somebody living with an impairment or an illness, and that is different, and that makes me anxious, leading on to the spread phenomenon, that thing that has been reported in, you know, people being afraid that, in a way, seeing a projection of their own future sometimes, and seeing with ALS, for example, you know, people go into groups and say, no, is that what will happen to me? Basically, the whole idea of illness is contagion, or contagious, or impairment is contagious, which leads into all these different metaphors of, okay, disassociation, no, I'm not going to go there, I'm not going to do this. The body beautiful. And we have this, again, idealized version or notion of what the body, our body, the human body, our physical body, is supposed to look like. And it is meant to have a certain size, a certain shape, certain color, perhaps. It is meant to be in a certain way, and that is the body beautiful notion that, at least in the United Kingdom, is an ideal, you know, an idealized version of what the body looks like, you know, and the body beautiful is young, and the body beautiful is lean, and then you get, as a final cultural belief that, you know, averts people from dealing with sexuality in occupational therapy and health in general, social disapproval. So because of all these notions, there is some internalized social disapproval going on there. Okay, yeah, I don't think it is for you. You're over a certain age, or you're living with a certain impairment, or with a certain illness. You should have other priorities. You know, we're going for needs here, for safety. Yeah, it's not quite what we're here for. So, I mean, that's one from a study I did a few years ago, just a very quick quote. There was so that guy, Yanis, he was living with spinal cord injury, and he was in his early 60s. And he was going out with a girl, and, they were, going out, and they were okay. But the girl said, okay, well, come on, people are staring at us when we go out for a coffee. We were not meant to be together, we can't be together. And there was all that social disapproval. How can you fit into my world? How can we ever be together? We are different. People don't approve of a relationship like that. And all these cultural beliefs, and nothing of that is, and all these are cultural and social and contextual beliefs. There's nothing that comes as part and parcel of any way of being or living in the world. It just prioritizing or valuing certain modes of existence over others. What I said before about the able-bodied, the able-bodied and the young, and monogamous and heterosexual sexuality. So all these cultural beliefs can lead to devaluing of sexuality as an important part of life, and there are some links that you can follow later. So what can we do? How can we address sexual needs? So we can start thinking about the rights-based approach in sexuality and what we do, and just, for ground and understanding of disabled people as active subjects, in rather than that whole idea before, the infantilized idea really, about that fallacy or that imaginary, that fiction infantilization and the fiction of lack of agency and lack of subjectivity. So just understand that just because somebody accesses services, just because somebody comes to the occupational therapy clinic, doesn't mean that they lack agency, doesn't mean that they lack subjectivity. So going back to the power imbalance that I raised at the beginning of the session, power imbalance doesn't need to be enacted in that way in a clinic. So we can look about, trying to include sexuality and talking about or structuring services with equality and non-discrimination, which means that because sexuality is a way of being, and a way of being, we all embody different ways of being. Everybody will be different in one way or the other. And as occupational therapists, we're not here to discriminate. Obviously, we all know that very well. And, we need to promote equality, but also participation and empowerment to what people need to do, and transparency and accountability in how we do that. And I think for me, the reason I mentioned this example is not to structure services, or not necessarily to structure particular or specific sexuality-focused services, but it's just to acknowledge that as part of the human experience, and to acknowledge that as part of the human experience, in any kind of setting, whether people need to talk about, like in the previous example, in the home modifications, sexuality was there, people wanted to share a bed, but there was a desire, again, there was that conflict there, but it was part, and maybe, if somebody had acknowledged that, or maybe if somebody had asked them about that, things might have been a bit different. Or maybe that is why things were like that, maybe because people disapproved of that. I don't know. But it's about acknowledging and respecting the right to sexuality for all clients. It's about recognizing the importance of sexuality as a part of life. And then, very importantly, to develop the skills, to develop the knowledge, to provide education, to provide intervention, which could be education, I suppose, but to provide intervention if that is needed. Because as we saw before, many people report that it is education that is lacking, that is what they don't have. So there was that model was developed many years ago, but it is still current. This is the model that it is still quite most often used in sexual education programs and for healthcare professionals. And there's been quite some research about that, and people use it in different ways. So, and it has been used with many different healthcare providers. So it's the placeit model. So the P stands for permission. And that's a very important part of the interaction. You need to give somebody permission to talk. And when I say permission, that can be implicit or that can be non-verbal, but you need to provide an environment that is an inclusive of everybody and different notions of sexuality. And sometimes you actually need to raise that to say, okay, some people have reported that this is an area of concern. Would that be the same for you? Or not? And if not, that's fine. If yes, okay, what can we do about that? But it's very briefly given permission, because many people reported in research that they're expecting clients, service users, to make the first step. But then service users report that they can't make the first step because they're not sure if it is appropriate. They don't get the sign sometimes that it is appropriate to raise it. The second stage is limited information. So, start talking to people about how sexuality might or might not be affected, or ask them how it has been affected, if it has been affected by whatever it is they're going through, by whatever the occupational interruption might be. Sometimes, people just need some encouragement or some, if you want, reinforcement that, okay, sexuality is not only that, that specific act, the sexual act, but it involves many more things. And, and if that particular, if erection, for example, is not possible any longer, how can we problem solve around that? There are specific suggestions that people can make, and then if you follow the link, and later on, you can see it brings you onto the link of a video done by, I think his name is Michael Tepper. He's a sexologist, and he lives with spinal cord injury. So he talks about positioning. different positions. And the last stage, which usually can be provided by specifically trained people, is intensive therapy. So what it is about being holistic and being person-centered, because despite recognition of the needs, despite recognition of the rights of disabled people to sexuality, and as you see, there is loads of research where occupational therapist reports reluctance to deal with this issue. And really, Tepper, the guy mentioned at the end, is the guy who did the video, who is in this video here, that you can access later. And age is one of the factors that. So you can follow some resources, and they're all, or most of them, they're all UK based, but some resources about sexuality and disability, if you're interested. But going back to this again.
I just want to let you know, we might have to move back to our lab in about 10 minutes. They're going to bump us out of here.
Okay, I think I'll be done in 10 minutes from the lecture, so that's good.
And then we can have the discussion in the class.
So going back to this table, we can see that again we're talking about factors like sexual preference and ability, disability, and gender and age. I should be here, shouldn't I? It's being recorded. I keep on forgetting. So these individual factors. But really, you have cultural values and values underlying policy that tell you what is right and what is wrong, what is acceptable, what is not acceptable. And in this case, the research is there and the evidence is there, if you want, from many people that, yes, it is important, but what do we do about it, or should we do anything about it? So I want to first... I will fast forward to occupational justice then. So I started this session talking about critical occupational therapy and how people, that notion of people being able and enabled to do the things they want to do in life, and that critical bit, that word critical, is just to bring to our attention all the instances where people cannot do the things that they want to do, and they cannot do those things because of disempowering values, disempowering programs, disempowering processes, whether it is a really, long drawn and, really long-lasting process of commodifications that only happen after, almost right before one dies, or whether it is because we think sexuality only belongs to a certain type of person. These are all processes that disable people. And if as occupational therapists we're looking for what the World Federation of Occupational Therapists has called as occupational justice, okay, where does that leave us? Where can we do about it? So the World Federation published a position paper in 2006, which has been ratified by the local associations, the national associations of occupational therapists, saying that occupational therapists have a right, a role and a responsibility to develop and synthesize knowledge, to work with groups and communities, to enhance participation in occupation for all persons. And that, to me, means that, okay, you need to look into what people want then and what people need and try to work. Yeah, and you have guidelines and you have limitations and there is a practice framework that you must follow, and obviously all the limitations, resource-related limitations. But how can you make sure that the priorities of your clients basically remain at the top of your own priority list? What happens there? How can you make sure that you can take these factors into account, so you don't only focus on the personal context, on somebody's age, gender, ability, disability, or health status, but you see how that fits in within the broader idea, the broader context of the culture, the cultural values of employment, community groups, income support, technology use. How does that fit? How does that all fit into somebody's life? So it's about that, if you want, expanding one's horizon to take account, understand, okay, yeah, occupation is a bit broader, it's individual, yes, but it happens within a broader context. So yeah, it's about thinking about all these factors, the factors that enable people, factors that restrict people, where do these come from, and can we work with them? Can we work to ameliorate them? Can we not? Sometimes we can, sometimes we can't, and that's life. But it's being aware of them. So this again is the statement paper by the World Health Organization, the World Federation of Occupational Therapists. So that critical occupational therapy that I talked about is about developing knowledge on instances where participation in daily life is restricted, but enabling that in the context where it happens. So it's about sometimes we in occupational therapy we talk about we are what we do and what we do is very important, but we also need to remind ourselves that we're not necessarily what we do, but we do what we can in a certain context. And it's about reminding ourselves that we as occupational therapists, we need to enable people to do what they can in a given context. And people are not always what they do. And then you can find the reference list at the end.